For those of you who have just arrived, for the last day and a half, we've been holding some internal discussions about U.S.-South Korean nuclear energy cooperation. And for those of you who don't know, in March 2014, the United States is due to make a decision about renewing the cooperation agreement that we have with South Korea, as we do with many other countries. And as part of these agreements are a number of conditions that were negotiated early on in the 70s, and there has been a lot of water under the bridge. There have been a lot of changes in the global nuclear landscape. There have been changes in U.S.-South Korean relations. There have been new technologies, new threats, and the emergence of a priority consideration of non-proliferation and global nuclear security for the global community, but in particular for the United States. There are obviously new economic trends. There are new energy sources that have hit the scene, most recently with shale gas and shale oil, that are cutting into the market share. There's obviously the nuclear accident at Fukushima. And so there's been a lot of changes going on, and there's a very dynamic landscape. In addition, with respect to the U.S.-South Korean relationship, in many respects, as some of our colleagues are articulating today, it really couldn't be at a higher point in terms of the overall political economic relationship. However, as South Korea is increasingly becoming reliant, in some cases, on nuclear energy and seeing their role as a prominent exporter across the nuclear fuel cycle, or at least in many stages of the fuel cycle, there are interests in changing some of the terms of that arrangement. And so this has become a hot button issue, increasingly hot button issue, especially during times of political transition, not only in the United States, South Korea, but also within and across Northeast Asia. So these are very heady times. This is a very delicate issue, and so we spent the last day and a half trying to dissect the issue, look specifically at the technological dimensions to it, the economic dimensions, some of the political and strategic dimensions, situated in the broader bilateral relationship and in the context of what's going on in the global nuclear energy landscape and, of course, in the regional security landscape. And so what we wanted to do is use this opportunity for us to distill some of the high points and some of the low points in terms of some of the challenges that may be affecting that relationship as it matures, especially on the nuclear side. But also over the course of the last day and a half, we've raised several issues that may be the foundation for developing and broadening and deepening that partnership. And so what we've done, Mansung and I, have asked several of our colleagues over the course of the last day and a half to distill some of those main points with respect to the challenges and opportunities. And so what I'd like to do is invite a number of my colleagues here to come to the podium and speak for about 5 minutes on those terms. And so the first person I'd like to invite is Professor Stephen Miller. Steve, as many of you know, comes from Harvard University as the director of the International Security Program. He is also very much involved in doing research on the changing landscape, if you will, of the global nuclear energy arena, as well as a longtime scholar of U.S. national and international security policy. So, Steve, please.
Well, thank you, Adam. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some final thoughts with you. My understanding of our mission here is to give a few kind of final thoughts in reaction to the day and a half of very interesting discussions we've had. And I want to touch on 4 issues. First, a number of our participants have noted along the way over the course of the last day and a half that, as a general proposition, U.S. relations with South Korea are in very good shape. Several people use that line about the best shape ever. And across a whole array of issues, there's a degree of harmony or a degree of cooperation or a degree of partnership that is really quite heartening and suggests that the alliance is really quite in robust shape. There is, however, one issue on which American and South Korean preferences currently collide sharply, and that has to do with the desirability in the short run of pursuing the plutonium recycle option. And the question I want to raise here is whether it makes sense, as many people suggested in their presentations, to frame the 1, 2, 3 issue as a strategic test of the alliance, as the acid test of the future of our relationship, to zero in on the one area where we have a fundamental collision of interests and make that the salient choice point for the future of the alliance. To me, it makes not so much sense to zero in on the one area where we have a fundamental disagreement of interests. And my fear would be that framing the issue in that way has the potential to do real harm to what is otherwise a very robust and durable relationship. So that's the first observation I would make. Secondly, I wanted to touch a little bit on why the United States is strongly opposed to further enrichment and reprocessing on a national scale anywhere in the world. As the Bush quote that I invoked earlier indicated, this is a global policy. It has nothing to do with Korea. It has nothing to do with doubts about Korea. It has nothing to do with worries about what Korea might do in the future. It has everything to do with 9/11, with American worries about nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the hands of bad guys. It has to do with the perception of at least 3, if not 4, consecutive American administrations that the #1 threat to American security is the potential of nuclear weapons or other WMD in the hands of radical bad guys coming in 2 stripes, states and non-state actors. So there is today an overwhelming consensus in the United States, certainly among the non-proliferation community of which I'm a card-carrying member, that we should do everything we can to inhibit the spread of weapons-related technologies in the WMD sphere. And for this reason, there is a desire to inhibit the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies for as long as this seems sensible. There are some who are, I would say, extremists who say we should never do it. There are others who say there's no need or reason to do it now, so let's put it off for as long as possible. And that's more or less the approach of the U.S. government, in my opinion. President Bush established a very clear marker on this. As far as I know, there's no one in the non-proliferation crowd in the Obama administration that diverges from that general orientation. And so Korea may see this as a test of the relationship or as a key to its own sense of its nuclear energy future. But for Washington, the enrichment and reprocessing program has to do with its global strategy for contending with what is regarded and stated in official documents as the #1 threat to American security. So those are contending visions, and I think that we have to work very hard to kind of manage the collision of those two visions to avoid harming our relationship. So you're going to find real opposition to pursuit of any form. You can call it pyro reprocessing, whatever you want to call it. Anything that produces usable plutonium. You're going to find resistance in the United States and criticism from the United States. It has nothing to do with worries about Korea. It has to do with this wider canvas on which we're operating. Now, the third point I want to touch on briefly is, so then there's a response to that that says, well, what about Japan? You let Japan do it. Why can't we have an exception just like Japan? And here I would make 3 points. One is the Japanese made their fuel cycle decisions basically in the 60s. So 50 years ago, everybody was in a different frame of mind. After 9/11, it's a different frame of mind altogether. Personally, I have not the slightest doubt that if Japan were in Seoul's position today and making the contemplations that South Korea is currently doing, it would meet with very similar reactions from Washington. The second thing is, I can tell you, having been part of it, that there have been American non-proliferators, both official and unofficial, streaming to Japan for years, telling them that their plutonium recycle policy is both strategically unwise and economically unsound. It's not the case that we have simply accepted this and embraced it and said, well, the Japanese are a wonderful exception and we're happy about it. The American community has been critical of the Japanese effort. And of course, there's a third point, which is more of a footnote, but from the perspective of much of the American community, the Japanese recycle policy has been an utter disaster. 50 years of massive investment, which has not gotten them very close to commercialization whatsoever, and with lots and lots of problems still persisting in their program. So this is not exactly a model to be held up as, as something that went well. And then, since we're limited to 5 minutes, let me close with the last point that relates to my first. Given the long timelines associated with the potential commercial viability of the plutonium fuel cycle, is it really necessary to have this fight now? And I'll stop there.
Our next speaker, and I may add that for those of you who just arrived, this whole workshop has really been a product of a partnership with the Korean Institute of Science and Technology. And my colleague and partner in arms here is Professor Mansum Yim, who's a professor of nuclear engineering and quantum physics at KAIST. And he's going to stand up and give us a couple of points from his perspective as well.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for staying, remaining until the end of this program. For those of you who've been with us for the last 2 days, and the new guest, welcome to our discussion. I think this is a very timely and important topic that everybody, at least in this community, ought to think about seriously. As Farid Zakaria puts it, we are living in post-American world. Thanks to the hard work of United States of America, we spread the liberal democracy across the countries, around the globe, and then because of that, the world has become better. But then the rest of the world caught up, they picked up, and then they are now challenging the United States. I think, as he puts it in his book, what are the trends, the global trends that's coming up in the future? Rise of the West will continue. It's not the US-dominated world anymore. Well, there used to be 2 superpowers, but then the one superpower is gone. There was one only superpower, United States, but that is going away with the rise of China. And then now Russia, taking advantage of the energy resources, they are making a comeback to the global stage. The rise of nationalism, evolution and spread of technology will continue. Deeper and connected trend of the nations. How would this trend shape up the future of this globe? I think the issues we're talking about here has something to do with this global trend for the future. Well, if United States is really concerned about what is happening out there in the world, we have to think about this question. What are the greatest dangers coming up in the coming years to the United States and to the globe? I think potentially there is the clash of values coming up. We, United States, was created under the premise, belief that everybody is created equally. everybody needs to be treated with dignity. Everybody deserves peace, prosperity. But then that whole notion may go away as the continuing trends of rising the rest continues. Certainly, the rise of China is causing problems in Africa. I think for the last couple of decades, we were able to remove or threaten some of the dictators. So all these dictators couldn't sleep well overnight, during night, when the United States was having some leverage. But now these leaders are sleeping well because China is there helping them, providing all this aid without asking any questions. I think that spread of that whatever you want to do concept, whatever the leaders wants to do to your people, I think is one of the greatest dangers we're facing in the coming years. And that threatens the identity of the United States as well. When the United States government saw the challenges coming in the early days of nuclear power development, President Eisenhower came up with the idea of atoms for peace. In fact, the atoms of peace was a sort of an imperative when this country saw the upcoming commercial race. Russia, China are gearing up, and France, UK are gearing up for the spread of this technology. We better take the lead in this and take control. And that's how the regime is established. And that regime is under threat at this point as these new powers are coming to the game again. So while we're bogged down with this idea of ENR discussions of, I don't know if Kenneth Walt's argument versus Scott Sagan's argument is valid in this, allowing countries to have weapons or not, whether that will be the really greatest dangers this globe is going to face. I think as I said yesterday, the shift Craig Pierce puts is needed from domestic energy option to international safety and security imperative for those people who are working in this community. What would be the best thing to do then in that regard, in this negotiation or coalition or development? I think the US-ROK collaboration in nuclear is not just something about ENR or whatever, the nuclear industry or just commercial interest. I think it could be a catalyst for a global norm, or it could be a catalyst to lay out maybe the reason why or each country wants to survive or prosper, to defend the fundamental values and assure everybody deserves what they deserve to have. So I think we should think about these big picture issues while we're discussing some of the details. And I'm actually, when I was given this opportunity to organize this workshop, my personal interest was not really something about US-ROK and companies getting more money and US have more money. And I think I see an opportunity for us to make a contribution to the big picture. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mansong. Our next speaker is Professor Bill Charlton. He's an associate professor of nuclear engineering. He's also the director of nuclear security science in the Policy Institute at Texas A&M. And for those of you who were here earlier today, I think his remarks may dovetail nicely with Mansong's because he laid out some of the tangible areas of cooperation. But that may not be what he's going to talk about now.
So I'll start by saying the same thing that everyone else has said, which is that it's relatively obvious to most of us that the U.S.-South Korean relationship is very strong. And as was mentioned this morning, a lot of that is based on the fact that we share common values. And those common values result in us having very similar positions in most things in the world. But I will go ahead and mention what I see as the big challenge here. And the big challenge, as has been sort of discussed, is, in my opinion, the back end of the fuel cycle. The enrichment part of the 123 agreement I personally don't think is really that big of a deal. enrichment technology it's a fundamental sensitive technology, but I don't think economically it really makes all that much sense for South Korea to worry about acquiring enrichment technology. Economically, the back end of the fuel cycle and reprocessing technology is not economically all that viable either, but the problem is that it does provide, at least in some people's minds, an impact on the public good, and one can forego with the economic benefit in order to seek out the interest of the public good. And it's difficult for us in the United States to argue with people about the back end of the fuel cycle when we have no policy on the back end of our fuel cycle in the U.S. So it's a little bit hypocritical for us to argue about it. And that's the big challenge. That's the thing that's going to have to be settled and worked out. And I see that as a big disagreement that has to be resolved, and I agree that it's probably not the most crucial issue in the world to resolve, but it is one that, at least amongst the nuclear community, is something that needs to be dealt with. In terms of my view of that, I think the right way to deal with it is sort of what Amir had mentioned earlier today, which is that it doesn't necessarily have to be resolved right now, as long as we could come to an agreement that allowed us to cooperate in terms of development. I think that would allow us to postpone really having to really focus purely on a legal agreement at this point, but to allow us to cooperate in terms of development and work together as partners to achieve something that maybe could actually help both of our countries, because here in the United States we have the same problem with spent nuclear fuel disposal. It is a major issue for us in our country, and maybe together we could come to a fruitful end state in which everybody would benefit from it. And I guess I'll stop there because most of my other points I think have all been made. Yeah, that's right.
Thanks, Bill. Our next speaker is Hee-Young Lee, who is the Senior Vice President, oversees nuclear project development at KEPCO. He is the Senior Vice President who led the UAE project. And for those of you who are just arriving, one of the hallmark developments in this changing nuclear energy landscape was the South Korean deal to construct the reactors in this newcomer state in the nuclear energy realm, UAE. So he brings to us a wealth of information and expertise, and was really there at the inception. We've been talking a lot about gold standards and the process, and UAE has figured a lot into our discussions, but here we have somebody who actually was in the middle of all of it. So please.
Thank you. Good to see you. I'm Hee-Young Lee, Senior Vice President of KEPCO, and I'm a nuclear salesman, not a nuclear arms dealer. So yesterday and today, I heard a lot of opinions about the relationship between USA and ROK, and I think all the discussions will be integrated and revealed as the result of business, finally. So, as I know, the important criteria of decision-making in the state is whether it is good for the national interest or not, as I know. So I bring some data based on the excellent testimony which Dan Lindman, our Westinghouse colleague, made a testimony in June before the Congress. So before my presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce my company, KEPCO. KEPCO is the largest state-owned electricity utility in Korea, and we supply the total electricity demand with 217 power generation facilities with a total capacity of 68 gigawatts. But our company has 50% of government equity, but the others from the public and foreign investors with 30%. And in 2001, according to the government policy, the generation part has been divested from KEPCO. So we have 5 GenCos of thermal power and 1 for a nuclear power plant. But they are still 100% subsidiary of KEPCO. So for nuclear sector, we have many subsidiaries, including KHNP for operation, KEPCO ENC for design and engineering, KPS for maintenance, and KENEP for field fabrication. In terms of overseas power project, we are the developer, investor, as the strategic partner. So we are operating 3.4 gigawatts of thermal and wind power, and we are now constructing 2 gigawatts of thermal power and 5.6 gigawatts of nuclear power in UAE. And also we have a uranium mine capacity of 350 million ton and coal mine of 1.6 billion ton. So as I mentioned before, I cited the Dan Rieman's testimony about the relationship between U.S. and ROK. U.S. exports to Korea in nuclear power plant since a long time ago, and U.S. exports to third countries to supply Korean projects, especially China. And U.S. established a joint venture for nuclear fuel with KEPCO, KENEP, and U.S. imports materials from Korea for AP1000 project in China and also in the state. And U.S. make cooperation for R&D project. So Korea is U.S. significant partner in trade and investment. So I brought some data since the Yeongwang Unit 3 and 4 because for the Yeongwang 3 and 4 we achieved the localization through the technology transfer. So we say that we achieved the technology self-technology reliance. So since that, for the domestic nuclear market, the accumulated amount is about $6 billion. But from now on to maybe 2030, maybe it will be double, including home and abroad. So in case of UAE project, for major equipment, we agreed to share exactly half and half from Doosan Heavy Industry and also from Westinghouse. So after contract award, we accelerated the business cooperation agreement between KEPCO and Westinghouse to share the domestic nuclear market and also overseas, possible overseas nuclear market. So in case of UAE project, I summarized, and the total will be over $2 billion. But it is between the Westinghouse and some parts of services and some with the BOP vendors. But in case of the project owner, Emirate Nuclear Corporation, they hire the CISTP and KAIST as the project management organizer. And also there are many services companies. For example, Exelon will be also the partner for some emergency planning and also training services for UAE. So there are indirect effect of UAE project, and now we have 4 units simultaneously, but maybe for more in some time. So I put plus alpha. So it will be, and it is just for construction. And if you think about the 60-year operation and maintenance, the service amount will be much, much higher than this overnight cost. And also, in terms of technical services, I put R&D and some services for NRC DC of APR 1400, and architect engineering services, system engineering, and field services. Up to now, we have $1.1 billion for technical services. And also, the supply chain is one of the critical issues for the nuclear renaissance in the world. So we have very strong supply chain, including major equipment and also BOP equipment. So for AP 1000 project of China and also of the Vogel, we are supplying many different kinds of components with high level of quality and very reasonable price. So if the 1-3 agreement renewal is delayed, what kind of impact will be? So I totally cited the same logic that Dan Riemann made a testimony before the Congress. The benefits of commercial nuclear cooperation will be put at risk, can put at risk tens of thousands of American jobs, and U.S. can be damaged in reliability as a supplier and partner. For example, UAE nuclear project, the reactor vessel will be delivered in 2014 and 2015. So before delivery, we have to get the export control from the U.S. government. So if the current 1-3 agreement is delayed, then it will impact on the construction schedule. As you know, we have in the international nuclear market, we have very worst case of construction delay. For example, in Finland, in France, and in China also, there are 5 years delay or 2 years delay, 1 year delay. It will cause a lot of money, and financing is also a very critical issue. So if the 1-3 agreement is delayed, then it will impact directly on the UAE project schedule. And the reliance of Korea and third countries on U.S. sources of nuclear components, technology, and services might reduce. And to make success in highly competitive commercial nuclear market, Korea can choose other countries for their partners instead of U.S. So by 2030, KEPCO has a very ambitious plan because for our company, we plan 2030, the overseas business share will be higher from 3% currently to 50% of total revenue. So we expect at least 10 more units in the world market, and we need for equipment and services, and this cost effect for U.S. will be up to $20 billion. So and of course it will impact on the job creation, and so KEPCO will be the strategic investment partner to other countries' reactor model. So because KEPCO is the state-owned company, different from Areva and Westinghouse, GE Hitachi. So we can be a strategic partners, which many project owners are thinking about. So we will be investor, we will be EPC contractor, and also we will be O&M operator. So KEPCO came to an emerging reactor technology supply because, as I mentioned, we observed the ABBC technology, and also we are applying the US-NRC safety concept, and licensing is also exactly the same with the US-NRC. So we are using all the technology and practice exactly the same with the US. So we have to take some responsibility and obligation as a reactor technology supplier in consideration of the nuclear leadership in the world market. And KEPCO pursues coexistence and co-prosperity with U.S. partners, including Westinghouse and other BOP vendors and services companies, through continuous cooperation and relationship. And we will contribute to the international nuclear market. So based on the business cooperation agreement between KEPCO and Westinghouse, we will expand the mutual cooperation for the domestic nuclear project and also the overseas nuclear project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Our next speaker is Dr. Charles Ferguson, who is the president of the Federation of American Scientists. And Charles is going to, he has talked a lot about the broad landscape of the nuclear domain and some of the challenges for international cooperation. But please.
Thank you, Adam and Man-Sung and all the colleagues for the last day and a half. The clock is ticking, and I don't mean necessarily the end of this workshop, which is overall, I think, been very delightful and enlightening. I mean, time is running out for all of us in the world. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it is dramatic. We're talking about something crucial to all people, reliable sources of energy, in particular, when it comes to nuclear energy, reliable sources of electricity, reliable and clean in the sense of essentially emitting no greenhouse gases for an operating nuclear power plant. We see demand across the world increasing and increasing for fossil fuels that, when they're burned, release greenhouse gases into the environment, will have dire effects to this globe, to humanity. Korea is, I believe, taking a very responsible step in increasing its share of nuclear-generated electricity. So right now, roughly a third of its electricity is from nuclear power, and by 2030, it plans for about half of its electricity from nuclear power. So it's increasing its dependency on nuclear power, and it's doing so because it does want to limit the greenhouse gas emissions into the globe, but it's also doing so because energy security is very important for Korea. Korea is one of the most energy resource poor countries in the world. It imports something on the order of 98% of its energy supplies. It doesn't really have any of its own fossil fuels. It's hard for Americans to get their minds wrapped around that. I grew up in western Pennsylvania. One of my grandfathers was a coal miner. Now Pennsylvania is known as a place for abundant natural gas, especially shale gas. So it's hard for a Pennsylvania guy like myself to really imagine this. But I've traveled around the world, been to Korea many times, been to places like Japan, which has similar concerns. That's why those countries in that part of the world are investing so heavily in nuclear power. and this is why it's crucially important for the United States to be a partner with Korea. The clock's also ticking on this nuclear cooperation agreement, and many of my colleagues have already spoken to that. But I want to address a few things that I don't think have come up yet. Let me just walk you through a timeline over the next roughly 10 to 20 years. So 2014, you've heard several times already, is the deadline for the renewal of the cooperation agreement. We should not let that lapse. I agree with Mr. Lee that we have a lot at stake economically. We have a lot at stake in terms of our political alliance and strategic alliance. There's another crucial date we need to keep in mind that hasn't been brought up yet, and that's 2016. That's the year, not too far in the future, when many of the pools at the nuclear power plants in the Republic of Korea will be at overcapacity for storing spent nuclear fuel. What are we going to do about that? And I mean we, meaning Koreans and Americans working together. Now, you have to understand in domestic context in Korea, there have been protests, violent protests, against citing even low-level, intermediate-level nuclear waste facilities. So imagine the level of protest in citing a high-level waste facility or a permanent facility for disposal of this nuclear waste. So this is foremost in the minds of Korean politicians. I think Americans just aren't aware of that. So we need to work together to at least keep the door open for alternative pathways for alleviating pressure on the buildup of this waste in Korea. One option is to do a joint project, an R&D project, investigating what's known as pyroprocessing. Sounds very, very technical, but it's an alternative means of trying to reuse plutonium and other fissionable materials that come out of spent fuel, and by doing so, what the aim is to reduce the volume and the ultimate heat load on a repository. So you need less space, it costs less money, we believe, to store this waste over the long term. Now, there's a lot of technical details to be worked out. So very smartly, Ambassador Park and his predecessor worked out a deal with the U.S. government to do a 10-year study, to do a joint R&D study to figure out how to address these challenges, technical, political, safeguards, non-proliferation challenges in managing this nuclear waste. So that's another element of the timeline that we're facing, where the clock's ticking. So we have to reach a renewal within the next year, year and a half. We have to at least give assurances to the Korean people that the U.S. is a reliable partner in alleviating the nuclear waste problem, but we can't solve it by 2016. And we have this pending study that's going to show its results at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. But that's not the end of the story. Because if the pyroprocessing approach or something like it is worthwhile and worth pursuing, it's going to take many decades beyond that to really put in place that type of solution. So we're talking about a long-term partnership here. We're talking about something that's going to last for decades, if not centuries to come. If you think about the life of a nuclear power plant, you have to think on the scale of 100 years for that plant. So that reactor in that plant will operate for probably at least 60 years, maybe 80 years for the most modern of the reactors. And then you have the decommissioning and waste management that we need to do in partnership beyond that. So I know Howard still has to speak too. So let me just make one more final point in terms of this vexing question of giving Korea advance consent to do enrichment and reprocessing. I've already talked about how we're trying to approach the reprocessing/pyroprocessing issue. I think by and large it's a smart approach in terms of this joint study and trying to assess our options fully and openly and transparently. But the uranium enrichment issue is something that has also come up. And I think Korea does have a strong case economically to say, as a country, the third or fourth biggest nuclear power producing country in the world, that could argue from an economic standpoint, it does make sense to begin investing in uranium enrichment. But on the other hand, you look at the decreased demand for nuclear power recently, post-Fukushima accident, there appears to be kind of a glut of uranium enrichment right now in the market. So it's not a pressing need for new enrichment suppliers. So I think there's been some interesting ideas that have come out in the last day and a half. One of them is from my colleague Miles Pomper to assess, can Korea and the United States do a bilateral relationship, mutual investment in uranium enrichment? We need to move as a world toward bilateral, multilateral approaches to enrichment and reprocessing. By doing so, we can alleviate some of the concerns. But if you have national owned and controlled facilities, that they could be misused in the future for proliferation purposes. If you have bilateral or multilateral owned and operated facilities, that risk, I would argue, is much reduced. So I think that's the pathway where we can move forward and address each other's concerns about limiting the spread of national enrichment and reprocessing while addressing Korea's valid concerns about assurances of fuel supply and nuclear waste management. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Charles. And the last speaker, before we open it up to some dialogue, is Professor Howard Hall, who is the director of the University of Tennessee's Institute for Nuclear Security. He also holds the governor's chair, professor of nuclear security at that institution. So Howard, please.
Thank you. I would echo the comments of my colleagues that I think one of the bright lights here is that this is a discussion, a vigorous discussion, but it's a discussion framed in a very strong relationship between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. So even though we may be struggling with this particular question, I think we should reflect on the fact that it is a relatively small hiccup in a very close and fruitful relationship between our two countries. The course of this discussion, I think over the last couple of days, we've talked about a number of very interesting issues. I think there are clearly strong arguments on the part of our colleagues from South Korea that issues of equity, issues of cultural respect, issues of mutual collaboration are very important in this relationship. I think in terms of the U.S. perspective, this is a decision that is not just a U.S.-South Korea agreement. This is a decision that in a perfect world would be guided by a comprehensive, integrated, self-consistent U.S. strategy on energy security. We unfortunately don't have that. We have economic interests, we have security interests that are very important here and both weigh in some conflicting ways on this particular agreement. I think I'm certainly I have no crystal ball, so I can't tell you which way this will come out. But I think an important characteristic of the outcome is continued close cooperation between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea, and an extraordinary level of transparency in whatever decision is made in terms of enrichment and reprocessing. I like the idea of multilateral or international facilities. I think that's very credible. I think we also need to continue to pursue building deeper and stronger ties between our two countries, and the exchange of activities and students and staff and so forth that we've talked about a bit. Those sort of grassroots connections are very important for that as well. Finally, I'd like to thank Adam for arranging this. Nansang kamsahamnida. And thank you all for your time and attention.
So we have a little bit of time left, believe it or not, and I'd like to invite anybody to either pick up some of the themes here or raise some new issues for consideration. I know we've exhausted a number of you, but I think there are several of them coming. Oh, Jeff, I can always count on you.
Adam, I want to appreciate the invitation and being part of this. The last day and a half has been kind of enlightening as I've seen the viewpoints the industry brought to bear with policymakers, certainly the industry, and Georgia Tech being the institution that it is and the center that you represent, amongst all of this set of challenges, I see opportunity. And one of the opportunities I see resides in the ability to leverage what you have here at Georgia Tech, along with the other academic institutions represented here in the form of the University of Tennessee as well as Texas A&M, to align itself with industry and drive the institutional debate with the institutions that are well represented right here in your own hometown in Atlanta, certainly with IMPO, with WANO. Certainly through that, you can bring NEI into the conversation. You've got Southern Company here as a leader here in the AP 1000, not to mention a host of utility companies and EPC companies in Charlotte, North Carolina. The ability to harness that type of intellectual power and convey to a set of new generation of students how they have to operate collectively as a new generation. What I see is an opportunity to take many of the talented students that I've had the opportunity to come to know at both the University of Tennessee, here at Georgia Tech and Texas A&M, and build a bridge such that you take these top-tier students and working closely with industry, you put them on some of these critical issues. You have outstanding policy groups in your institutions. You have outstanding engineering aspects. I know at Georgia Tech you have an outstanding robotics lab. So the ability to generate the kind of synergy among those disciplines to solve some of these very complex policy and technical issues, I think is what's been presented. And the fact that Amir was here this morning and presented, I think, a very clear picture of the industry engagement, I think that to me is what you presented here and the opportunity to capitalize. So that to me is the challenge that you have as the center.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, let me just, I guess, conclude by noting, making several observations from my vantage point. As I am not an area specialist in East Asia, nor am I a nuclear engineer, but I do dabble in the area of nuclear security, and also international security broadly. And I'm struck by the problems, and this sort of picks up some of the points that I think Steve Miller mentioned, with framing this relationship and even the nuclear cooperation relationship around a technology that's not mature and a set of economic variables that are very fluid. And rather, there are some very tangible interests and intangible shared values that center around issues related to nuclear security and nuclear safeguards that I think may be reflected in some of the tangible ideas that Bill and Howard and some of the others have mentioned, that may be the foundation for reformulating, and if not reframing, the way that we think about this cooperation relationship, because those are the areas where our commonalities are undisputed. And given the timelines that Charles had given us, and that we need longer-term perspectives, and we need time for the technologies to mature and for the economics to make more sense, and where we have less time in dealing with some of the security types of issues associated with the nuclear industry and the nuclear sector in general, that I think reframing the 1, 2, 3 effort as a way of forging partnership on safety and safeguards issues that may, as byproducts of those dialogues and very tangible efforts in promoting joint R&D and multinational efforts, and byproducts may be the technologies of the future that will make economic sense for both countries and for the industry as a whole, and help to sort of get us away from these points of acrimony. So to pick up some of the themes that were raised right before we broke for lunch, that focusing on those sort of collective goods issues as the strategic framework around which to build this very tangible set of commercial and safeguards and security-related initiatives that could then produce the kinds of positive commercial externalities out of that may be a fruitful way of thinking about it. But that's the charge that Man-Sung and I have in trying to distill from this day and a half set of dialogues a set of concrete issues that we want to develop and conduct more research on. And it's in that regard that we'll be following up with all of you in the weeks and if not months to come. So on behalf of Man-Sung and my colleagues here at Georgia Tech, I want to thank you all for joining us over the last day and a half. I think we really did more than scratch the surface on technical, economic, political, and strategic issues that are both bones of contention or emerging as bones of contention. But we've also begun to identify rays of hope and rays of optimism that we really want to explore in much more depth. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to being in touch with you all in the very near future. Thank you.